Snowmelt dripped from the cabin's ruined eaves in steady ticks, each one louder than the last, in the silence that wrapped the Bitterroot Valley. Mara Ellison stood in the doorway, her breath shaking in the cold dawn light, staring at the deep tracks circling the cabin like a slow-moving predator. Not animal tracks. Boots, heavy ones, fresh enough that the edges still held their shape. Whoever had been here had walked right up to the windows, paused long enough to fog the glass, and then disappeared into the trees without leaving a single broken branch behind. She tightened her grip around the handle of her father's old revolver. Empty, but the stranger wouldn't know that. Her heart beat hard in her throat, too loud, too frantic, but she forced herself to breathe. Boston felt a lifetime away, and the woman she'd been there would have run screaming back down the mountain without a second thought. But loss does something to a person. It strips the softness first, then the fear, and what's left is someone who can stand alone in a doorway and stare danger straight in the eye. Wind pushed through the pines, carrying the early scent of snow, even though the sky was still clear. The first winter storm wasn't far off. The valley seemed to exhale with it, a long, cold warning. Mara backed into the cabin and shut the door, wedging a chair under the latch, even though the wood was too thin to stop much more than a stray wind. She had arrived only yesterday, and already the place felt like it was testing her. The floorboards creaked when she crossed them, brittle beneath her boots. Dust layered everything in a color that felt like grief left too long in one place. Her aunt's rocking chair sat in the corner under a blanket of pine needles that must have drifted in from some gap in the roof. Her breath made ghosts in the air as she knelt by the stove and coaxed life back into the embers. Heat crawled out slowly, reluctant as any mountain creature waking from a long sleep. She fed the fire anyway. She would need the warmth today. She would need everything she had. The boots outside had belonged to someone with patience. Someone who walked without haste, but with purpose. Someone comfortable in a place that made everyone else uneasy. She tried to push the thought aside as she hauled her luggage inside one trunk, a bag of tools she barely knew how to use, and a folded telegram that had changed her life with 12 words. Her husband and baby gone. Her debts towering. Her aunt's property, the only thing left tethering her to the world. She had held that telegram for days before finally stepping onto the train, leaving the graveyard of her old life behind. She wasn't ready for how quiet Montana was. Quiet in a way that felt alive. While she patched the broken window with oilskin, she felt it again, that prickling awareness at the back of the neck. She looked up sharply, but the trees stood still, their shadows laid long and thin across the meadow. Nothing moved except the slow dance of dust motes catching the light. Her aunt had chosen solitude. Mara wondered for the first time whether solitude had chosen her aunt right back. She stepped outside again, slower this time, studying the line of trees that swallowed the land beyond her clearing. The tracks disappeared there. Whoever had come wasn't afraid of the woods. They moved through it like it belonged to them. A lone hawk circled overhead, crying out like it was calling a name the valley already knew. She tested the revolver in her hand again, the weight familiar but useless. She'd only ever fired it once years ago at a county fair and missed the bottle by a mile. Now she held it because it made her feel less breakable. The wind shifted, carrying the faintest scent of wood smoke. Not from her cabin. Somewhere deeper in the forest. Someone lived close by. The wagon driver's voice drifted back to her, then gravelly and uneasy. Folks say a man roams those ridges. Elias Redfern. Lives too wild, too far gone to remember he's human. Mountain folk loved their stories, but the look in the driver's eyes hadn't been a story. It had been caution. Respect, even. Mara scanned the ridge again, searching for any sign of life. A flicker of movement caught her eye, a a shadow pulling back behind a fallen pine, too quick to identify, too deliberate to ignore. The revolver trembled in her hand, despite her efforts. She hated that tremble, hated how grief had hollowed her bones and left her with nothing but that tremble to show she still felt anything at all. "Who's there?" she called louder than she meant to. Silence answered. A raven lifted off a branch, wings beating against the cold air. Its cry echoed across the clearing, sharp and unsettling, and then everything went still again. Too still. She stepped back toward the cabin, keeping her eyes on the tree line. Whoever had been watching her this morning wasn't watching anymore. That felt worse somehow. Inside, she shoved the chair back under the door and leaned her weight against it. The fire crackled behind her, warm on her back, but the warmth didn't reach her hands. She needed to gather wood, to fix the roof, to check the water line, to scout the paths before the snow came. She needed a dozen things she didn't know how to do yet. But the mountain wasn't waiting for her to learn. She moved toward the small crate of tools and pulled out the axe. Its handle was worn smooth and the blade held a nick from someone else's years of work. She felt steadier holding it. Outside, the cold nipped her cheeks as she crossed the clearing, heading toward the tree she'd chosen earlier to split for firewood. Every swing of the axe beat a rhythm that steadied her thoughts. The wood cracked open, cleanly falling into neat halves at her feet. She split another louder this time, letting the sound echo. She wasn't afraid of being alone. She wasn't afraid of the wilderness. She wasn't afraid of the man who might be watching her from the shadows. But as the last piece of wood fell away and the forest swallowed the sound of her breath, she felt it again, the certainty that someone else had stepped out into the snow at the same moment she had. Someone who knew these mountains far better than she did. Someone who had already circled her cabin once today. She straightened, pulse sharp in her throat, and listened. The wind answered first, then the trees. Then something else so faint she almost missed it, a footstep on packed earth, measured and quiet. Not animal, not accident, human. Mara gripped the axe tighter, heart pounding as the steady tread grew closer through the pines. The mountains had found her. Now she had to decide what kind of woman she was going to be. Up here, even the walls listen. Nika Two Horses said, her voice low enough that the wind nearly carried it off before Mara could catch the words. Mara tightened her grip on the small bundle of fallen branches she'd gathered and tried not to show how sharply her pulse jumped at the stranger's sudden appearance. Nika had stepped out from between two lodgepole pines, as if the forest had breathed her into existence, no warning, no sound, just a quiet watchfulness in her dark eyes. She looked no older than Mara, maybe younger, with long braids bound in leather ties, and a quiver slung comfortably across her back. Her confidence stood out. She belonged to these woods in a way Mara could only hope to learn. "I didn't hear you coming," Mara said, realizing, even as she said it, how useless the words sounded in this place. "You weren't meant to." Nika's gaze swept over Mara, the cabin beyond her, the tracks half hidden by the morning frost. "You're the new one. The one who came alone." Mara nodded. "I'm Mara Ellison." My Aunt Millie's niece Nika finished for her as if she had already known. "I figured. Millie used to leave tobacco offerings by the creek every spring. Said it kept the storms gentle on her roof." Her eyes moved to the patched window and the collapsed porch post. "Looks like the storms got tired of waiting." A flush warmed Mara's cheeks. She'd spent half the day fixing the broken window with oilskin and the better part of the morning hauling fallen timber to shore up the porch. Her hands were raw and scraped her back stiff, but the cabin stood a little straighter now. She was proud of that. Still, Nika's assessing gaze made her feel as though every weakness she carried, Even the invisible ones were plain as sunlight. I'm getting things in order, Mara said, hearing the defensiveness in her own voice. Nika only tilted her head not unkindly. The valley watches newcomers. Some it leaves be. Others. She let the sentence trail off, her eyes drifting toward the tree line. Mara followed her gaze. The trees stood frozen and silent, holding secrets behind their trunks. She couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. The memory of that steady footstep from the evening before came back with uncomfortable clarity. You've been watched since you stepped off the wagon, Nika added matter of fact. Some people walk loud. You don't. Mara swallowed. Did you see anyone near my cabin, a man? Nika asked, brow lifting slightly. Mara hesitated. I think so. Nika let out a slow breath, her expression shifting from curiosity to something more serious. There are only a few men who come this far up the ridge. Hunters, trappers. One in particular people talk about more than the rest. She adjusted the strap of her quiver. It's his way to watch first. Mara's heart thudded once heavy and hard. Do you know him? Nika shrugged. I know of him. Everyone does. He stays out of sight unless he wants otherwise. A beat passed. He saw you. That means he's thinking about something. A shiver crawled down Mara's spine. The uncertainty of who he was, why he watched what he wanted, hung in the air, like frost that hadn't decided whether to melt or bite deeper. Nika stepped closer, lowering her voice. This land is old. Older than the fences people try to draw around it. It remembers who treads softly and who doesn't. Her eyes softened just a little. You're trying. The valley can sense that. Millie did too. Mara looked toward the cabin. The smoke from her morning fire drifted upward in thin, fragile ribbons. It still didn't feel like home. It felt like stepping into someone else's skin, someone stronger, someone who understood how to breathe this thin air. I want to stay, she said quietly, surprising even herself with the firmness in her tone. Nika nodded, as if she'd been waiting to hear it. Then you'll need to learn quickly. Winter is coming early. Cold already carries teeth. She pointed toward the logging axes near the cabin wall. Your woodpile is small. Too small. And your roof still shows daylight in 3 places. She paused. But you can fix it. If you listen to what the land tells you. Mara let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. I'm trying. I know. Nika's voice softened further, and she glanced again at the tree line. And so does he. Mara's fingers tightened around the bundle of wood. This man, whoever he is, does he have a name? Yes. Nika studied her carefully, as if measuring whether she should speak it. Elias Redfern. The sound of it settled into Mara's mind with unexpected weight, as though it had already belonged there. Elias Redfern. The one who moved silently. The one who watched. A gust of wind stirred the pine needles at their feet, and Nika stepped back as if the forest had called her. You'll see him again, she said with quiet certainty. No one watches that close unless they plan to. Mara's pulse quickened. She didn't know if she should be relieved or terrified. Before she could ask anything more, Nika turned her footsteps soundless on the forest floor. Remember, she called over her shoulder, the mountains watch back. Then she was gone, vanishing between the trees, swallowed by the same silence she had emerged from. Mara stared after her for a long time, the wood heavy in her arms, the cold biting through her coat. Elias Redfern. The name echoed in her thoughts, slow and steady like the heartbeat of the land itself. She returned to the cabin and added the logs to the growing pile by the wall, the axe handle warm from the morning's work. She forced her breath steady and kept her movements calm, but the unease from the night before had changed shape. It was no longer fear of the unknown. It was the sense that something in these mountains had noticed her, and whatever it wasn't done watching yet. "You shouldn't wander where the mountains whisper your name," the man said, his voice deep enough to settle the air around them. Mara froze where she stood, breath trapped in her chest. The clearing she'd stumbled into was quiet in a way that felt intentional, as if even the wind had stopped to listen to him. She turned slowly, her fingers tightening around the strap of her canvas satchel. Elias Redfern stood half in shadow, half in sun, tall, broad, and impossibly still. His coat, worn from years of mountain storms, shifted only when he moved to close the distance between them. He did so without a sound, as if the ground had learned long ago not to betray his steps. His eyes, dark and steady, watched her with the kind of caution you might reserve for a wounded animal. Mara had imagined many versions of the man who had circled her cabin, but none of them matched him. He wasn't wild-looking or ragged. He wasn't threatening. He was something else, dangerous in a quieter way. A man shaped by isolation, not savagery. "I didn't know anyone lived out here," Mara managed, forcing her voice to stay level. She kept her stance still, trying not to appear cornered. "You're 20 minutes from your meadow," he said, not bothering to answer her statement. "This trail doesn't belong to newcomers. It belongs to the ridge. I wasn't trespassing. You weren't invited either." The words should have stung. Instead, they held an undercurrent she couldn't quite name. Warning, maybe, or responsibility. She glanced at the structure at the center of the clearing. It wasn't a cabin exactly, something between a shelter and a workshop. Logs cut with clean precision, stones fitted by hand, smoke rising faint from a pipe chimney. It looked lived in but not inhabited, like it was ready for whoever came back, but didn't depend on them. "You built that," she said. "Yes. It's beautiful." His gaze shifted to her sharp enough she felt the weight of it on her skin. "Beauty isn't what keeps a man alive." "No," she said gently. "But it can keep a man human." Something flickered in his expression. Surprise maybe, but it vanished as quickly as it came. He gestured toward the trees behind her. "You tracked an elk 1/2 mile, then stopped following it for reasons I can't understand." "I wasn't tracking anything," Mara said. "You were," he corrected. "Just poorly." Heat rushed to her face. Whether from embarrassment or irritation, she wasn't sure. "I'm learning the land. That's what people do when they're making a home." "You don't learn these mountains," he said. "You survive them." Mara swallowed hard, fighting the instinct to argue. Instead, she lifted her chin. "Surviving is what I came here to do." He studied her for a long moment. There was something in his eyes then, something like recognition, or memory, or maybe even respect. She couldn't tell. "You're not built for this," he said softly. "You don't know what I'm built for." Again that flicker of something unguarded. She wondered if he meant to say it, or if the truth had slipped out before he could catch it. The air between them tightened, not with threat, but with the quiet possibility of understanding. Elias stepped past her and moved to the edge of the clearing, surveying the tree line with a practiced eye. "You're being watched." Her heart lurched. "By who? Everything?" "That's not an answer." He glanced over his shoulder. "It's the only one that matters." Mara clenched her fingers around her satchel strap. The forest pressed close again, full of shifting shadows and the faint crackle of unseen life. She thought of the tracks around her cabin, the fogged window, the sense of being observed. "Were you near my cabin yesterday morning?" she asked quietly. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "If I had been, you wouldn't have seen me." That's not a denial. It's not meant to be. The world seemed to narrow then, just her, Elias, and the stretch of winter-thin forest between them. She didn't know if he was warning her or protecting her, maybe both. He stepped closer, his voice lowering. "The ridge doesn't forgive carelessness. Don't wander this far again unless you want the mountains to decide what happens next." Mara wanted to argue. She wanted to stand her ground. But the certainty in his voice, the kind that came from years of hard-won experience, pulled the fight from her. She nodded once. Satisfied, he turned toward the shelter, checking the woodpile, the rope lines, the door hinges. He moved like a man used to doing everything himself, and used to logging every detail of the world around him. Mara took a step back, preparing to leave the clearing. Before she could speak, he said, "Your roof won't survive the next snow." She stopped. "How do you know I saw the sag in the north beam?" "You saw it from here." He looked at her for a long moment, and something like a weary smile ghosted across his mouth. "I see everything." She didn't know what to say to that. Instead, she watched him move through the clearing with the kind of focus she'd only seen in men who'd lived through more than they spoke about. When she finally turned to head back toward her own land, she felt his gaze on her again, not intrusive, not unkind, just aware. Alert. "Stay close to the creek on your way back," he said, his voice carrying easily. "And keep your fire going tonight. Cold moves in fast." Mara hesitated, then nodded without turning. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of distant snow across the clearing. She felt it settle in her bones, a sharp reminder that the mountains operated on their own terms. As she followed the narrow path home, the forest felt different. Not safer, not friendlier, but clearer. As if some unseen boundary had been crossed, and the land had taken notice. The shadows lengthened, stretching toward her, as the first thin hush of cold crept through the trees. Winter was coming, and the ridge was done being patient. "No one survives a bitterroot winter alone," Elias said, though he wasn't standing in her doorway when the words reached her. They came back to Mara later, echoing against the roar of the storm that slammed into the valley without warning. The morning had started deceptively calm. A thin sun hovered over the ridge, cold but bright enough to convince her she had time to finish reinforcing the north side of the roof before real snow came. She'd worked for hours, numb-fingered and stubborn, trying to wedge planks into place while the wind tugged at her hair like impatient hands. Each time she looked toward the forest, she felt the weight of Elias's warning from the day before. By mid-afternoon, the light dimmed. Not gradually, not gently. It simply dropped as if someone had pressed a hand over the sun. The wind turned sharp. The air thickened. She felt the shift before she saw it, the sudden pressure in the sky, the way the trees stiffened their branches, bracing for impact. The storm didn't roll in. It fell. Sheets of snow lashed sideways across the meadow, stinging her cheeks and clogging her breath. Mara stumbled back toward the cabin, boots slipping in the rapidly deepening drifts. She had a moment to shove the door closed behind her before the storm slammed against it like a body. The cabin shook, the walls shuddered. Snow shrieked across the windows, reducing the world outside to a white blur. Mara leaned her back against the door, panting. The stove crackled quietly in the corner, its small fire no match for the fury outside. The temperature dropped so fast, she watched her breath appear in clouds. She moved quickly, feeding the stove, checking the shutters, pushing rags into the cracks near the floorboards, where icy air leaked through. She tried not to look at the ceiling. The north beam, already troubled, groaned under the sudden weight. A long, low creak rippled across the timbers. "Hold," she whispered, as if the roof could hear her. "Just hold." The storm had barely begun. As darkness folded over the valley, Mara lit the lantern and set it on the table, its glow a trembling circle in the vast cold. She made tea hands, shaking so badly she spilled some, and wrapped herself in every blanket she owned. The wind's howl was constant, rising in pitches that sounded almost human. The roof groaned again. She flinched, staring at the sagging board above her bed. Snow pressed into the gaps, powder drifting down onto the blankets like sifted flour. Her stomach tightened. If the beam split, if the roof gave way. She didn't let herself finish the thought. Hours passed, or minutes. Time twisted with the wind. She forced herself to stay awake, feeding the fire when it dimmed, checking the beam every few breaths. The storm raged with a violence she'd never seen, never imagined. Somewhere beyond the whiteout, she wondered if Elias was out there in it, or safe in his hidden shelter. No. She pushed the thought away. The man had lived through winters far worse. This storm wouldn't take him. But whether it would take her, that was another matter. Close to dawn, exhaustion dragged at her limbs. The fire was dying again, but when she rose to add wood, the roof let out a sharp, cracking snap. Mara gasped and stumbled back. A splintered line carved itself across the north beam, thin as a knife, at first widening with each groan of stressed timber. Snow filtered down in soft sifts. Outside, the wind roared harder, pushing more weight onto the weakened roof. Her knees buckled. "This can't be happening," she murmured, voice trembling. She grabbed her coat, boots, gloves, anything that might help her reach the roof from outside, but the thought of stepping into that white wall of wind made her freeze. The storm would kill her faster than the roof could. She backed toward the stove, shaking, wrapping her arms tight around herself. The beam cracked again, louder. The roof sank another inch. She held her breath. Another crack. Another shower of snow. Then a thud. Heavy, solid. Something hit the roof. Then another. Then another. The storm didn't make thuds. Mara rushed to the window, wiping frost away with her sleeve. She saw almost nothing, white shadows swirling snow, but then a dark shape moved across the roofline, wielding something long and flat. A shovel. Her breath caught. Elias. He moved with speed and certainty, clearing the heaviest drifts off the sagging section snow, flying in arcs behind him. The wind fought him, tearing at his coat, throwing ice against his face, but he didn't slow. Not once. She couldn't see his features, only the set of his shoulders, the surety of his movements. Everything about him said he had done this before, and worse. The storm pushed, and he pushed back harder. Minutes, or what felt like minutes, passed before the worst weight was lifted. Elias knelt, inspecting the beam from above, then disappeared from view. Mara's pulse hammered painfully. She staggered away from the window, heart tripping between relief and fear. A sharp knock rattled the door. Mara Elias's voice muffled through wind and wood. "Let me in." She tore the chair from under the latch and pulled the door open. Elias stumbled inside, snow coating his hair, his beard, his coat. He looked like he'd been carved from the storm itself. How did you?" She couldn't finish the sentence. He shut the door behind him, leaning his weight into it, as another blast of wind slammed against the boards. His breath came hard, steam curling from his lips. "Beam's cracked," he said. "It'll hold if we brace it. I brought what we need." "You shouldn't have come in that," Mara whispered. His eyes met hers, dark, intense, unyielding. I wasn't letting that roof take you. Heat rushed up her throat, fierce and unexpected. He stepped closer to the stove, rubbing snow from his gloves, then glanced at the sagging beam. We'll work fast. Storm won't ease for hours. Mara nodded, legs still unsteady, but something inside her steadier than before. Because she wasn't alone. Not in this storm. Not in this valley. Elias Redfern had come for her. And the mountains, for the first time since she arrived, didn't feel quite so cold. If you're cold, then I'm staying. Elias's voice was low, steady, meant to be practical, but it carried something warm enough to cut through the icy air filling the cabin. The second storm arrived without the courtesy of warning. One moment, the mountains held a brittle stillness, the sky washed in pale winter light. The next moment, the wind surged in from the ridge with a sound like a gate, tearing loose from its hinges. Snow slammed sideways across the clearing, shrouding the world in a thick white veil. Mara barely had time to latch the shutters before the cold knifed its way in through every seam in the woodwork. Elias had been repairing the outer support beam when the storm hit. She'd watched from the window as he secured the last brace, his shoulders hunched against the rising wind. She expected him to head back toward the forest, slipping into the trees the way he always did, silent and self-contained. But he didn't. The storm hit too fast. Now he stood just inside her doorway, coat dripping, hair dusted with frost, breath clouding in the air. Snow clung to him like an extension of the storm itself. Yet his eyes were calm, assessing the room. The weakened roof, the dimming fire. You can't go back in that, she said, voice thinner than she intended. I wasn't planning to. Her heart tightened at the simplicity in his tone. He shut the door behind him, bracing it as another gust slammed against it, hard enough to rattle the hinges. Mara added a wooden bar across the frame, but the wind pushed with the force of a bull. Elias set his hand against the door and pushed back until the pressure eased. The cabin trembled. Snow hissed across the roof. The lantern flame jittered wildly, stretching shadows across the floorboards. Mara moved to the stove, feeding it more wood, but even standing directly in front of it couldn't chase the cold from her bones. She rubbed her arms through her thick sleeve, trying to hide the tremor in her hands. Elias noticed. He always noticed. Blankets aren't enough in a storm like this, he said quietly. You'll freeze before morning. I'll manage, she said, though the words sounded weak to her own ears. Elias shook his head. Storm took a turn. Winds shifting from the gorge. That kind of cold knocks a grown man to his knees. She swallowed. So what do you suggest? His gaze held hers steady and unflinching. Shared warmth. Heat rushed up her throat even as the cold gnawed at her limbs. She turned slightly, pretending to check the fire, but she could feel the weight of him behind her, the certainty. It's what folks do to keep alive out here, he added, softer now. Nothing more. Mara nodded, though her pulse raced with something that wasn't fear. She spread an extra blanket on the bed, bracing herself as the cabin creaked again under the storm. Elias removed his coat, his movements practiced and unhurried, then sat beside her close enough that the heat of his body reached her instantly. He lay down first, leaving space. She hesitated only a heartbeat before lying beside him, pulling the blanket over them both. The bed was narrow, their legs brushed. His shoulder pressed warm against her arm. She felt the slow rise and fall of his breath, steady grounding. The cabin no longer felt like a fragile holdout against the storm. It felt smaller, warmer, alive with something she was afraid to name. Her mind drifted toward the past, toward loss, toward the life she'd fled. Grief had carved sharp places inside her, and being this close to someone anyone felt like standing barefoot on shards of glass. Elias must have sensed her tension. "You're shaking," he murmured. "It's just the cold." His voice warmed. "Not all of it." She closed her eyes, forcing her breath steady. "I'm trying." "You're doing more than trying." A long silence stretched between them, not empty but full. She felt him shift slightly, his arm brushing hers again. A soft hum of warmth spread from that touch. The storm howled, rattling the shutters. Mara pressed closer without thinking, seeking warmth or comfort, or perhaps something deeper that she had forgotten how to seek. He didn't move away. His body stayed steady beside hers, heat radiating into her chilled limbs. After a few minutes he spoke again, quiet, almost tentative. "Back when the storms came early, he said my daughter used to crawl under the blankets with me and her mother. Said she liked the way it sounded the wind. She said it made the cabin feel brave." The world around Mara stilled. She turned slightly, seeing the flicker in his expression. Pain. Memory. Something tender that had been buried too deep to show itself easily. "What was her name?" she asked gently. A long moment passed. Long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Lila," he said finally. "She would have been 8 this spring." The ache in his voice pierced her chest, clean and unexpected. She reached out before she could stop herself, her hand brushing the back of his. A simple gesture. A fragile one. He didn't pull away. The storm roared louder, but inside the cabin the moment softened. The air warmed. The distance between them, small as it was, shrank further. "You loved her," Mara whispered, "with everything I had." She let the truth of that settle between them like a slow heartbeat. Her own losses pressed against her ribs, her husband, her child, the ache that never truly healed. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two people holding their own broken pieces up to the firelight. Outside, the snow piled higher. Inside, warmth found its way through cold bones and tired hearts. Mara's voice lowered. "I'm sorry." Elias exhaled quiet, long. "Me too." Their hands stayed close. Close enough to touch. Close enough for the possibility of something unspoken to stir between them. The wind screamed again, fierce and wild, and Mara flinched. Elias shifted, turning toward her, one arm reaching over her shoulders in a slow, careful motion. He didn't pull her close, he simply offered his warmth, his steadiness, the soft shelter of his presence. She leaned into him, her forehead settling lightly against his chest. His arm tightened just enough to keep her steady. "You're safe," he murmured. She hadn't felt safe in a very long time. The storm raged on, relentless. But inside the cabin, a quieter storm took shape, one that warmed instead of froze, one that carved space for something she had thought gone forever. She didn't sleep. Neither did he. They lay together through the long, dark hours, sharing breath and warmth and the quiet truths of people learning to trust again. When the wind finally eased near dawn, Mara lifted her head, listening to the sudden hush outside. Elias looked at her with eyes shadowed by exhaustion and something deeper. "The storm's letting up," he said, but neither of them moved to rise. The cabin felt different now, less like a refuge, more like a beginning, and far beyond the walls across the frozen meadow, something else moved in the snow. Horses, voices, the sound of men approaching, unaware of the peace they were riding into. "Redfern, you can come quiet, or you can come cold." The voice carried through the thin morning air before Mara even saw the riders crest the edge of the meadow. She froze midway through fastening her coat, pulse stuttering as hooves crunched over the snow-hardened ground. Elias stepped away from the woodpile the moment he heard them, his body going still in that way he had, like the land itself held its breath around him. 3 riders, one wearing a badge that gleamed like ice in the pale light, another beside him narrow-faced, nervous, but trying to hide it. The third carried himself like a man who thought the land belonged to whoever paid him most. Mara recognized the sheriff from town, though she'd only seen him once when stepping off the freight wagon. Calder. Thick mustache, heavy-set, with a stare like someone who always assumed guilt. Beside him rode a young deputy, slimmer, tense, but watchful, Orrin Huxley, she remembered someone mentioning. The third man wore a fine wool coat, mismatched with the cruelty in his eyes. Mining man. Butte, no doubt. Snow cracked under their horses as they approached the cabin. Mara instinctively stepped closer to Elias. Calder dismounted with a grunt, boots sinking deep. "Elias Redfern," he announced, not bothering with courtesy. "Got business with you." Elias didn't answer. He merely shifted his weight, placing himself half in front of Mara, in a way that looked unconscious, yet deliberate. Mara felt heat rise in her chest. Protective or not, she refused to hide behind him. She stepped forward, so she stood at his side. Calder's gaze flickered to her, and something like annoyance crossed his features. "You the new homesteader?" he asked, not waiting for an answer. "Shame you found company that'll bring trouble to your door. State your business," Elias said, voice calm, steady. Calder pulled a folded paper from inside his coat. "Got a warrant from the Butte magistrate. Says you're wanted for the murder of James Morin." The name hit the air like a blow. Mara hadn't heard it before, but the way Elias's jaw tightened told her everything she needed to know. His breath left him in a single sharp exhale. Not shock, not guilt. Recognition. Pain. The mining man came forward, chin lifted. Morin was a respected business owner, paid his dues, had friends in decent places. Folks won't let his killer walk free. Elias's gaze sharpened like a blade. "Is that what you call him now, respected?" The man sneered. "More respected than you." The wind carried the scent of incoming snow, thin and metallic. Mara felt it in her bones, the shift in the air right before something irreversible broke open. "What happened?" she demanded, looking to Elias, then the sheriff. "What are you accusing him of?" Calder handed her the paper, though clearly only to shut her up. "Witnesses claim Redfern shot Morin behind his saloon 2 weeks back. Unprovoked. Left him in the mud like an animal." "That's a lie," Elias said, still controlled, still quiet. "You know it. Morin wasn't the kind of man who met his end without a reason." Calder bristled. "Doesn't matter. Morin had standing in Butte. Miners, owners, clerks, they liked him. And they want Redfern brought in before someone decides to take justice into their own hands." Mara looked to Orrin Huxley, whose nervous posture suggested he didn't believe half of what Calder was spouting. His eyes kept flicking between Elias and the ground. Not guilt conflict. "What did Morin do?" Mara asked softly. Elias didn't answer. His silence said more than words. Calder reached for the cuffs. That was when Mara moved. She stepped squarely between them, heart pounding so hard it hurt. "You're not laying hands on him until he tells me himself." Calder stared at her, incredulous. "You planning to stop me?" "Yes," she said, surprising even herself with the strength in her voice. Elias placed a steadying hand on her arm. "Mara." "No," she whispered fiercely, not without knowing. Elias looked down at her eyes, shadowed with something heavy gratitude, regret, something deeper she wasn't ready to name. He exhaled once, long and low. "Morin hurt a woman," he said. "Wasn't the first time. I intervened." His jaw tightened. He drew on me. I drew faster. Mara felt the world tilt. She could see it, Elias stepping into a darkness no one else dared face, doing what others were too afraid to do. Calder snorted. That's his story. You can tell it again in the Butte courthouse. Elias straightened shoulders, squaring. He looked almost resigned, not defeated, a man who had long accepted the weight he carried. I'll go, he said. Mara's breath caught in her throat. You don't have to, I do. He met her gaze. There's no running from this. Huxley flinched as Calder grabbed Elias's wrist and snapped the cuffs into place. The sound was louder than the wind, too loud. Mara felt something inside her fracture at the sight. Calder glanced at her. Best stay put, Miss Ellison. Minor towns aren't kind to folks who meddle. Huxley's eyes met hers briefly, almost apologetic. Then he looked away. They began leading Elias toward the horses. The mining man smirked as he passed. Mara couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The world narrowed to the sight of Elias's broad back, the way he didn't resist the quiet pain in the set of his shoulders. She forced herself forward. Elias. He turned just enough to meet her eyes. I'm going after you, she said. Her voice cracked, but her resolve didn't. I'm not letting them take you alone. Something softened in his expression. Only for her. I know, he said. Then they pulled him away. Snow began to fall again, quiet and steady. Mara stood in it, fists shaking, breath steaming in the cold morning air. No one survived a bitterroot winter alone. She wiped the falling flakes from her cheeks, unsure if they were tears or melting snow, and looked toward the road the riders had taken. Elias was gone. But she was already thinking of what she had to pack, what she had to learn, and what she was willing to risk. Whatever waited in Butte, she would face it. Because Elias had walked into the storm for her, now it was her turn. Truth dies easy in a town fed by money. Deputy Orrin Huxley said, rubbing a trembling hand over his jaw, as if trying to steady something inside himself. The words hung between them in the dim hallway of the courthouse, where lantern light flickered against cracked plaster, and the muffled roar of Butte echoed from the street outside. Mara stood perfectly still, cold fingers wrapped around the fabric of her skirt. She had slept little since arriving 2 nights on a boarding house cot, hours spent walking the thunderous streets lined with saloons, gambling dens, and mine shafts that swallowed men whole. Smoke poured from the towering stacks, mixing with the clamor of wagons and the metallic clang of ore carts. The entire city felt like a furnace built on the edge of greed. She clung to one truth: Elias was alive. Locked away alone, but alive. Huxley lowered his voice. Sheriff Calder thinks this is open and shut. The city wants a villain, and Morin was good at twisting a story long before he died. He hurt a woman, Mara said, meeting his gaze directly. You know he did. Huxley flinched. Knowing and proving are different things here. Morin's partners have money. Money buys the story people hear. He swallowed hard. But I didn't see Elias shoot him. I wasn't there. I can only tell what I know. And what do you know? She asked. That Morin's men hate the idea of Redfern walking free, and Calder is too afraid to cross them. Mara's heart tightened with a mix of frustration and fear. Is there anyone who will speak against Morin? Huxley hesitated. There used to be. Women mostly. Servants, dancers, girls. But people who need work in a place like this don't go against a man with that much power. His voice dropped. Some who tried disappeared. Mara inhaled sharply, the cold slicing through her. She had seen men like Morin back in Boston, men who believed their name granted them access to anything they wanted. Money didn't simply corrupt, it shielded. She reached for the hallway wall, steadying herself. I need to talk to his workers, his neighbors. Anyone who... You won't get far on your own, Huxley said. People don't talk to strangers. They talk to those they trust. And right now, they trust none of us. Footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor. Mara and Huxley turned to see Nika Two Horses emerge from the shadowed stairwell, snow still dusting her shoulders. Mara exhaled, stunned. She hadn't expected to see Nika here hundreds of miles from Bitterroot. Nika joined them silently, giving Huxley a long, unreadable look. Word of your trouble reached the mountains, she said to Mara. I figured you'd need someone who knew where to listen. Mara reached out and grasped Nika's hand. Thank you for coming. Nika nodded once, then turned her gaze to Huxley. What do you know of Morin's past? Huxley swallowed again. Mostly rumor. But I know this, he liked to pick women who wouldn't be believed. Then we find one who will speak. Nika said. Huxley looked uneasy. You're asking for a miracle. No, Nika said calmly. For the truth. They left the courthouse together and stepped into the chaotic streets of Butte. Lanterns glowed behind slanted windows, drinkers staggered between saloons, and coal smoke curled through the narrow alleys. Mara did not feel fear this time, only a fierce focus that burned steady inside her. They spent the first hours moving through the miners' quarter. Men with soot-covered faces nodded gratefully at Nika, whose presence commanded respect. Women peeked through worn curtains, some curious, some wary. At a boarding house attached to one of Morin's old properties, a woman with a bandaged hand cracked open her door, listened to Nika, then shook her head sharply. I have 2 sons, she whispered. I'm not crossing Morin's partners. They'll starve me out. Her voice trembled with regret as she shut the door. Further down the street, a Salish elder recognized Nika, spoke quietly with her in the fading twilight. But he too had no names to give, only warnings. Morin's partners hold long grudges, he said. If Redfern truly fought for a woman, she should not be punished for surviving. But these men, they turned survival into shame. Hours passed, the sky darkened, and a cold wind whipped through the alleys. Mara felt her hope dim with each refusal. She could not prove Elias's innocence if no one would speak. By the time they reached the edge of the red light district, even Nika looked weary. Huxley hesitated. Last place Morin was seen alive is just beyond this. You won't like what you find. We're going, Mara said firmly. They stepped into a narrow lane lit by red lanterns, each window glowing with muted color. Mara's stomach tightened. Women drifted between doorways, some painted bright, some pale and exhausted. Laughter echoed from a saloon at the far end, harsh and brittle. A girl no older than 16 stood under a tattered awning, hugging her shawl around her thin frame. Her eyes darted nervously between strangers searching for danger or escape. When she saw Nika, something in her face loosened recognition, maybe trust. You're Millie's niece, the girl said softly. She used to bring warm bread in winter. Said we deserved more than scraps. Mara's throat tightened. I did not know her well, but I want to honor her. The girl hesitated, then stepped closer. You're looking for someone who'd speak about Morin. Yes. The girl's breath quickened. She glanced around, then motioned them into the shadow of a doorway. There was a woman. A mother. Morin ruined her daughter. Her voice cracked. Daughter didn't live through the winter after. Mara felt the world tilt. She works at the laundry now, the girl whispered. On Copper Street. Gray building with the sagging roof. Will she talk to us? Mara asked gently. If you tell her you came for Redfern. Yes. Hope surged through Mara so sharply it hurt. Thank you, she said fiercely. The girl nodded and slipped back into the lantern light, disappearing into the wandering crowd. Mara, Nika, and Huxley made their way toward Copper Street. Snow began to fall lightly, muting the noise of the city. The laundry was exactly where the girl had described it, a tired building with steam creeping from a cracked chimney. Inside, heat and soap stung the air. Women bent over washboards, hands raw and red. One of them looked up when they entered a middle-aged woman with grief etched so deeply into her features, it seemed part of her bones. Her eyes landed on Mara, then Nika, then Huxley. And when Mara whispered Elias's name, the woman's hands stopped trembling. She straightened slowly. I'll speak, she said. Voice steady, unbroken. I'll tell them what Morin did. Mara closed her eyes for a moment, a tremor of relief coursing through her. When she looked again, the woman stood tall, as if finally reclaiming a piece of herself. Outside, the snow fell thicker, and Mara knew she was no longer walking into that courthouse empty-handed. I thought my heart was winter-killed. Then you touched it. Elias said the words quiet enough to be swallowed by the mountains, if the air had not gone utterly still around them. The judge's gavel had barely fallen before Mara pushed through the press of bodies, her breath catching, when she saw Elias standing unshackled, no longer a prisoner, no longer bent beneath a weight not meant for him alone. He looked different in freedom, taller, lighter, as if a long season inside him had finally broken open. The woman from Copper Street had testified with a clarity that stunned the courtroom into silence. Faces' hardened whispers spread like sparks, and even Calder had avoided Mara's gaze when Elias was acquitted. When the chains fell from his wrists, Elias didn't rejoice. He only searched for her. Now they stood in the hallway beyond the courthouse where the noise of Butte hummed through the walls like an overheated engine. Mara reached for him, unable to stop her hands from rising. Elias caught them gently, his rough palms warm around her fingers. You shouldn't have come, he murmured, though his eyes said the opposite. I couldn't stay, she whispered. Not while they twisted who you are. He shook his head slowly, as if her faith in him remained the one thing he could not reconcile. His thumb brushed her knuckles, and the warmth of that touch softened some old ache lodged deep inside her. Nika waited near the exit, quiet and steady, giving them space without stepping away. Huxley lingered farther down the hall, looking like a man forced to measure every word he'd ever spoken. His conscience was no longer something he could hide. Elias finally exhaled, shoulders loosening. Let's get out of this place. They walked through the courthouse doors together into cold sunlight that felt newly earned. Snow still lay in dirty ridges along the street, but the sky above was a brilliant, unforgiving blue. Butte bustled around them with its constant racket ore wagons grinding over cobblestone miners, calling to one another, saloons, spilling voices and fiddle music out into the road. Elias wrapped an arm lightly around Mara as they wove through the crowd. She felt steadier leaning into him. Not reliant, just steadier, as if her spine had found its missing brace. Where will you go now? Huxley asked, catching up with them at the corner. His voice was hushed, almost wary. Home, Elias said simply. The deputy nodded, then cleared his throat. I'm sorry for not speaking sooner, for not being braver. Elias met his gaze, calm and unblaming. You spoke when it mattered. Huxley looked away, emotion tightening his features. Watch your back. Morin's partners won't be happy with the verdict. We'll be careful, Mara said, and the deputy offered her a small, grateful nod before turning back toward the courthouse. Nika joined them, then falling into step beside Mara. You two aren't meant for this city, she said. The mountains have been listening for you. Mara smiled faintly. I've missed the quiet. That valley isn't quiet, Nika corrected. Just honest. They spent one more night in town, Mara, at the boarding house Elias somewhere he wouldn't say, but where he assured her he was safe. In the morning they bought supplies for the trip home, flour-dried beans, fresh tools for repairing the cabin cloth for warm bedding. Mara found a soft blue fabric and imagined a dress she might finally feel comfortable wearing. Elias noticed her holding it and gave her a look that sent warmth blooming across her chest, though he said nothing. Before they left, Nika took Mara aside. His shadows will follow him, she warned gently. And yours will too. But shadows don't win unless you stand still. Mara held her gaze. I don't plan to stand still anymore. The journey back to Bitterroot felt different than the one that had carried her away. The mountains rose into view like an embrace held open, the wind sharper but cleaner, the world quieter in all the ways she needed. Elias rode beside her the entire way, their horses moving in easy rhythm. She caught him watching her sometimes softly, like a man relearning the shape of hope. When their eyes met, she didn't look away. The sun dipped low by the time they reached the edge of her meadow. Snow shimmered across the field untouched except for deer tracks. Her cabin stood firm, though scarred by winter. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney. Someone had tended the fire. It wasn't me, Elias said, amused at her bewildered glance. Nika stayed here a night before coming to Butte. She wouldn't let the place freeze. Mara felt her throat tighten with gratitude. Inside, the cabin's warmth felt like a small miracle. Elias set the supplies down and turned to her. The lamplight softened his features, washing him in gold, catching on the faint lines by his eyes. You saved me, he said quietly. You walked into danger for me first. That's different. How? He hesitated, then stepped closer until she could feel the heat of him. Because I didn't believe anyone could save me. Her breath hitched. But you believed I would try. His voice dropped. I did. She reached up, cupping his cheek with trembling fingers. His breath shuddered at her touch. He leaned into her hand like a man who hadn't felt tenderness in years. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind against the cabin walls. Then Elias gently slid his hand around her waist, pulling her close in a slow, careful motion that felt like a vow rather than a boldness. Their foreheads touched. You're my home, Mara, he whispered. Her heart seemed to unfold in her chest, warm and steady. And you're mine. They did not kiss, not yet. The moment didn't need it. Connection lived in the quiet between their breaths, in the way their bodies fit, in the shared warmth that filled the small cabin. Later, as they sat by the fire with blankets over their knees, Mara rested her head on his shoulder. Elias's arm curled around her, protective and gentle. Snow began falling outside, silent and steady. The storm inside both of them had finally eased, and somewhere deep beneath the blanket she'd drawn over her lap, a flutter of warmth stirred low in Mara's belly, a soft, unfamiliar sensation, as delicate as new life stretching toward the light. Sell or be swallowed. The mining representative's smile never reached his eyes. It was the kind of smile meant to soften a threat, and it only made Mara fold her arms tighter across her chest. The man stood at the edge of the meadow beside his bay horse coat, far too fine for mountain travel, every button polished. Behind him, 2 surveyors hammered stakes into the half-frozen earth, as if claiming the valley was as simple as marking a map. Elias stepped between Mara and the stranger, not rudely, but with enough quiet authority that the man had to tilt his chin upward to keep eye contact. "We're not selling," Elias said. The representative sighed theatrically, brushing snow from his gloves. "Progress comes whether a man welcomes it or not. Copper companies need timber, land, water access from this creek." He pointed at the thin ribbon of icy flow behind the cabin. "You're in the way." Mara felt the words hit her stomach like stones. Elias stood firm. "This land isn't for sale," he repeated, "not even for a generous price." The man's smile sharpened. "A homestead out here is a hard life, especially in winter, especially for a family." Mara's jaw tightened. Something softened in Elias's stance, but only barely, just enough to signal the man had stepped too close to a boundary he didn't understand. "We raised this cabin with our own hands," Mara said, her voice steady despite her rising pulse. "And we'll keep it standing." The representative's expression changed. He no longer looked amused. "This is bigger than you," he said, "and bigger than your cabin." Elias took one step forward. "That's enough." The man swallowed and flicked his reins. "Consider the offer. You won't get a second one so polite." He rode away, surveyors trailing behind their stakes, jutting like scars against the snowy ground. When they disappeared into the trees, the silence left behind felt too large, too hollow. Mara pressed a hand to her belly. Instinct, not thought. Their son Tommy slept against her chest inside her coat, bundled warm and peaceful. He breathed tiny puffs against her skin, unaware of warnings that hung like thunderclouds. Elias looked at her then. Really looked. Worry lined his forehead, the same worry he'd been carrying since their return from Butte. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. "I'm thinking the world is changing," Mara answered. "And it won't stop at our doorstep." Elias exhaled slowly. "I hoped we'd have more time." Time. The one thing the valley never gave freely. That night after Tommy fell asleep and the fire burned low, Mara sat by the table mending a tear in Elias's coat. Elias stacked chopped wood outside until the cold chased him in. His hair was dusted with frost, his jaw tight. "You're quiet," Mara said without looking up. "So are you." She set the needle down and met his gaze. "Elias, tell me." He pulled out the bench, sat heavily, and rubbed a hand over his face. The man from Butte wasn't lying. The mines out there swallowed nearly half the hillside. Companies are hungry. They'll push until they get what they want, and they don't care who they crush. Her chest tightened. "Then we fight." He gave her a soft, pained smile. "Mara, these aren't men you fight with an axe or a rifle. They fight with money, lawyers, men paid to do things quietly." Her pulse quickened. "You think they'll come back?" "I know they will." The room felt colder. The valley outside, usually a comfort, felt suddenly small. Footsteps crunched on the porch before she could speak. Elias was on his feet instantly, hand on the door handle, body tense. The door opened to reveal Nika Two Horses, her braid dusted with snow, breath misting in the air. "You saw them," she said simply. Elias nodded. "Surveyors. So they've started." Nika replied. "The Salish Council heard rumors. The companies think no one will resist a slow approach." Mara swallowed hard. What do you know? Nika stepped inside, shaking off her coat. They want the timber first, then the creek. Once they take the water, everything else falls in their hands. She looked between them, her expression a mix of warning and sorrow. This valley will not look the same in a year. The fire crackled softly. Tommy shifted in his sleep, sighing as Mara held him closer. Elias's voice was low. We could move deeper into the ridge. Higher, harder to reach. Nika shook her head. That only delays it. Once they take the lowlands, they'll climb the slopes. It always happens in steps. Mara's eyes stung. This is our home. Nika's voice softened. Homes can move. People can't not when the land is cut away under them. Elias paced to the window, staring out at the dark line of trees. His shoulders weighed heavy like he was holding up more than the roof. I don't want to run, he muttered. Not again. Mara stood crossing the room to lay a hand on his back. He didn't move. She felt the tightness in him, the coiled ache of a man who wanted permanence in a world that refused to give it. We wouldn't be running, she said softly. We'd be choosing. Elias closed his eyes. The fight drained out of his posture slowly, painfully. When I found this valley, he said, I thought I'd found the one place untouched by the world. You did, Mara whispered, until the world changed. Tommy whimpered lightly, rubbing his cheek against her coat. Elias turned at the sound, looking at their son, with an expression that held more tenderness than any words. Nika stepped forward, voice gentle but unyielding. I know a place in Oregon. Foothills west of the mountains, deep woods, rivers still clean, land still respected. She paused. If you want it. Elias met Mara's eyes. The choice hung between them, heavy, raw, but clear. He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers, as if anchoring himself. We will go where our family can breathe, he said. Mara exhaled, relief and grief tangling together. The valley outside was silent, watching, listening as always. But the mountains knew when a story had reached its turning. I'll look back once, only once. Then I'll follow you. Mara whispered, her breath trembling in the cold morning air, as the first light of dawn spilled across Bitterroot Valley. Snow lay quiet on the meadow, soft as memory. Their cabin stood behind her, smoke curling up from the chimney in a thin, patient ribbon. It looked almost like it always had weathered, stubborn, holding on. Except now its windows were shuttered, its tools packed away, its hearth swept clean. A home gently closed, not abandoned. Elias tightened the cinch on the last wagon, glancing at her with the kind of look a man gives only once he realizes he's leaving behind a piece of himself. Tommy slept peacefully on his back, bundled in soft fur, his tiny breath puffing against Elias's coat. Mara turned away from the wagon. The pull of the land was too strong to face with any distraction. She walked into the meadow alone. Frost cracked softly beneath her boots. The air held the scent of pine resin and distant snowmelt smells. She had learned to love smells she wasn't sure she'd ever find again in quite the same way. The clearing where she stopped was the same place she had first heard Elias's voice the first day he stepped out of the trees, like a warning and a promise all at once. She closed her eyes, letting memory wash over her. The fear, the defiance, the unknown shape of him, and then all the days after that, rough, honest, healing days, where the unknown became the anchor she held on to, not the danger she ran from. Goodbye, she whispered to the ridge as if the land itself might be listening. Something inside her tightened, sharp and final. She opened her eyes and let them trace the horizon. Mountains rising like jagged truth, pines standing like witnesses, snow drifting lazy in the stillness. She would look back once, only once. Then she turned. Elias stood a few paces behind her, watching without speaking. His eyes held the deep, steady understanding of someone who knew how hard it was to untie the knots inside a heart. "You ready?" he asked quietly. She stepped toward him, each step surer than the last. "I am." He offered his hand. She took it. Their fingers intertwined naturally, instinctively, as if there had never been any other way to stand beside each other. Nika waited near the wagon with 2 horses already saddled. Her expression was unreadable, but her presence was a steady warmth. She had promised to guide them through the safer passes on the western side before returning north. Her people, her land, her ties were here, but she wouldn't let them leave without protection. "We ride at the first break in the frost," she said. "The trail won't wait long." Elias nodded in thanks. "We trust your lead." Nika's gaze softened at Mara. "You carry the valley with you. That's enough." "You sure you won't come farther?" Mara asked. The faintest smile touched Nika's lips. "My roots drink from these mountains. Yours need new soil." Orrin Huxley approached from the tree line leading another horse. He had ridden since dawn to meet them, a risk Mara didn't take lightly. His hat was dusted with frost, and his breath came in sharp clouds. "I wanted to see you off," he said, clearing his throat as if unused to saying anything meaningful aloud. "And to give you this." He handed Elias a folded paper. "Survey maps. Show where the mining crews aim next. Thought you should know what's coming." Elias took it, jaw tightening. "Thank you." Orrin looked at Mara, then something apologetic and proud flickering in his eyes. "You two gave a lot of people courage. More than you know." Mara squeezed Elias's hand, feeling the truth of that settle quietly inside her. Tommy stirred on Elias's back, letting out a soft, contented sigh. Elias reached up and brushed a hand over the baby's small fist. "We should go," Elias said softly. The wagon's wheels creaked as he climbed up. Mara took the seat beside him, tucking blankets around Tommy. The horses stamped, eager to move but waiting on their cues. Nika slid onto her mare. Orrin mounted his own. The air shimmered with the cold hush of morning. Elias looked back at the cabin one last time. Mara followed his gaze. "I never thought I'd leave this place," he said. "You're not leaving," she murmured. "You're carrying it with you." Their shoulders touched. Their breath mingled. And then the moment passed, turning into motion. Nika urged her horse forward. The wagon followed. The valley unfolded before them, slow, quiet, solemn, almost as if it were bowing its head in farewell. As they reached the bend in the road, where the trees grew thick enough to swallow the view, Mara felt something deep inside shift. A final stitch pulling tight. A chapter closing with tenderness and ache. She looked over her shoulder. Once. Only once. The cabin stood in the distance like a memory carved from wood and winter. The meadow glowed faintly in the new light. The trees rose to guard it. And then the turn in the road hid it from sight. Mara let out a shuddered breath, feeling Elias's hand slide over hers. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she whispered. "I am." Ahead of them stretched forests she had never seen, rivers she had never touched, land waiting to be known, to be learned, to be lived in. Elias leaned close. "Wherever we go together. Together. Not anchored to what they had lost, but lifted by what they had built." Tommy cooed softly, as if sensing the shift. Mara smiled, smoothing a hand over his tiny head. The wagon rolled on wheels, carving new tracks through the fresh frost, following Nika's sure path, moving toward Oregon's deep green promise. And Bitterroot Valley, steadfast and vast, faded behind them, no longer their refuge, but forever their beginning.